Okay, I think we'll get started, everyone. We've got some participants rolling in. That's wonderful. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Business Support Series webinar. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Cindy Mann, Membership Sales Manager here with the Halifax Chamber, and your host for this morning's session. Return to work planning doesn't need to be complicated, but it can be creative. Often organizations struggle with finding meaningful tasks that are beneficial for both the injured worker and the organization. Return to work planning is also the most effective way to tackle injury duration. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions for our presenter. When we get to the Q&A, feel free to type any other questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar screen. Our presenter and guest speaker today is Dallas Mercer, founder of Dallas Mercer Consulting. In this webinar, Dallas will share her wealth of industry experience implementing successful return to work plans. Welcome, Dallas, and thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Cindy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So today's session is about breaking down barriers and the value of return to work planning. So again, I welcome any questions to answer. We can answer them at the end of the presentation. So the objective today is to heighten the participants' sensitivity around the importance of return to work planning for both the employer and the worker, and as well how to participate and mitigate some of the common barriers with return to work planning. So Cindy did introduce us, but just to provide a little bit of background. So we were founded in 2002. We have an office in Newfoundland and Labrador, in New Brunswick, and in Nova Scotia. We work currently with over 550 employers across Canada, helping them with their disability management, sick leave, and workers' compensation cases. And all the work is done from the 3 offices in Atlantic Canada. And we work with organizations that are union, multi-union, and of course, some are non-union. So, you know, we have a lot of background, I guess, in helping our clients with return to work issues. So the agenda today is a little ambitious, but hopefully we'll get through it all. So I'm going to talk about return to work, about claim duration and the benefits of returning to work. We're going to go through some of the legislation that's currently in place at workers' compensation and human rights, some of the barriers with regards to return to work, and then finally we'll just talk about some practicality of implementing a return to work plan. So first of all, what is return to work? So it allows an injured worker to engage in meaningful work while they recover from their injuries. And you know, long ago, or probably not that long ago, a lot of employees didn't come back to work until they were 100% or until they were recovered. So, you know, having a return to work process allows workers to recover and still contribute to the organization while they are recovering. So it should be customized to the worker, and you have to obviously consider what the worker's functional abilities are. So there's 2 scenarios. There's early and safe return to work. So it's a worker who is recovering and you bring them back early while they're recovering. And there's also the obligation to reemploy. So when a worker reaches maximum medical recovery, or they've recovered as much as they can, and then whether or not, you bring the worker back to work. So we're going to talk kind of loosely about both scenarios. So return to work and claim duration. So claim duration has the greatest impact on the cost of the workers' compensation system. Studies show that a worker who's injured and off work for more than 6 months actually has a less than 50% chance of returning to work. And we all know that it takes about 21 days to form a habit. They say it takes about 66 days for that habit to be automatic. So it doesn't take long for a worker to get out of the whole work process. So you might be asking yourself, what's claim duration? So duration is the amount of time that a worker is off work. So the way the workers' compensation system measures duration is captured by the Association of Workers' Comp Boards of Canada, and it's called the composite duration. And the composite duration looks at the length of time a worker is off work, the total number of work days. And the way they do it is over a 5-year window, because we all know a claim doesn't end at the end of a calendar year. So this calculation of using the composite duration of 5-year window gives us a more accurate picture of how we're doing. So in case you're not aware, Nova Scotia has one of the highest durations in the country. And this significantly contributes to the cost of the system. And the only way to address duration and claim duration is through return to work processes. So before we get started, so that we can put it a little more into context, I'd like to first go over the claim duration statistics. So the composite duration in Nova Scotia, meaning the number of days that a worker, average number of days per claim, has increased significantly, as you can see, from 2014, 2015, 2016, up to 117 days in 2017, 2018 was 126, 2019 was 147. So as you can see that the duration has increased quite significantly in Nova Scotia. So, you know, if you put this into perspective, 147 business days later, if a worker was injured today, February 24th, they wouldn't return to work until September 17th. Or sorry, not today, it's not February 24th, but if it was February 24th. So that's nearly 7 months off work, which is, you know, a considerable amount of time. So who benefits from return to work? So obviously the employer benefits. So if you retain experienced employees. So, you know, it's really challenging. We all know that sometimes to, you know, to hire the right people or find the right people, or you invest in your people. So being able to retain your employees is quite a benefit. Also reducing turnover. So you have less people coming in, and then the costs, of course, of having to retrain people. Better employee relations, also maintaining productivity or lowering workers' compensation costs. And setting expectations. So it's really important for people to have their expectations set in advance. It makes, if your employees know in advance that you are going to accommodate them, then it provides for a better workplace. For the employee, social connections are so important, and we all know that. I mean, we spend so much time at work, and so much of our social lives are captured in our work lives. So for employees to be able to maintain those social connections is really important. There's also a sense of purpose and value when you're able to stay at work. There's financial security. Obviously, it eliminates a wage loss. Also, they can retain their skills. It provides for better morale, sees management's commitment to health, and there's a sense of security and stability. So everybody benefits from return to work. Co-workers, employers, unions, healthcare providers. We also need to remember that the performance of the group affects everyone in your industry. So you as an employer, the benefits of returning people to work and your ability from a performance perspective to be able to accommodate people and keep people at work affects everyone in your industry, because that affects the base rate, because you have the base rate and your experience rating, and it's your group's performance that will impact the base rate. So, you know, even though you may be competitors during, you know, it's important to share return to work processes, and that can be of a very high value for your industry. So return to work isn't just the right thing to do, even though we just talked about that. It's also the law. I mean, as an employer, you have an obligation to bring people back to work. So workers' comp's interpretation of the legislation. So the legislation is section 89 to section 101, and that can be found in the workers' compensation. That's the workers' compensation legislation, and its interpretation can be found in the policies. So by way of an overview, the Act contains the provisions requiring certain employers to reemploy injured workers once they're ready to return to the workplace. The reemployment is intended to return the worker to work as close as possible to their pre-injury position. So the interpretation of that is in the policy. So the policy encourages healthcare providers, injured workers, employers, and all other parties to work cooperatively to explore all reasonable and creative flexible solutions to design plans that will facilitate the injured worker staying at work when possible, or an early and safe return to work. You should keep in mind that, all this information is confidential. While I realize it's important that sometimes you need to share the functional abilities of a worker in order to be able to accommodate them, you should always be mindful that these matters, should be kept as confidential as possible. So next, I'm going to go through some of the policies, and just, I'm not going through them in great detail, but I just want to highlight them so that you're then comfortable to look them up or review them, and it can help you apply some of them to your own workplace. So in accordance with policy 511, employers, so this outlines who has to participate with return to work. So any employer who has 20 or more employees, except those in the construction industry, are required to reemploy workers who sustain a work-related injury. So you can read a lot more details in that policy, and you can find it on the workers' compensation website. So I'm just giving you a broad overview. Policy 5.12 explains that for a worker to qualify for reemployment, they must be employed for 12 consecutive months and have lost time, obviously, as a result of a workplace accident. This also applies to workers who are seasonably employed or who contract or are temporary, or contractors or temporary workers. So if there's a pattern of continued and repeated employment with the pre-injury employer, if that can be established, then the reemployment obligation would apply to them as well. So policy 5.22 explains how it works. So offers of reemployment are linked to the worker's ability to return to work. Workers who are able to return to work to perform either essential duties of their pre-injury job or other suitable work are eligible for reemployment obligation. Based on fall evidence, there's two main paths that reemployment can follow. So the worker is able to perform the essential duties of their pre-injury work, or the worker is able to work but not able to perform the essential duties of their pre-injury work. So let's look at a couple of scenarios that are explained in this policy so that we can better understand this. So if you look at policy 5.24, if a worker can perform the essential duties of their pre-injury work, then the employer is obligated, if able to do so, to offer to reinstate the worker in their pre-injury employment immediately when they receive notice. And what are essential duties? Essential duties are the core tasks which achieve the usual outcome of the work at a normal rate of productivity. If the employer is unable to reinstate the worker in their pre-injury employment, then the employer must offer alternate work that's equivalent to their pre-injury employment. And if alternate work is unavailable, then they have to offer to reemploy the worker in suitable work. And suitable means suitable in duties, functional demands, obligations, rights, rules, earnings, qualifications, and opportunities, and any other aspect of the job that could be seen as relevant. So in scenario 2, and this is contained in policy 522, if a worker can't perform the essential duties of their pre-injury work, then the employer is obligated to offer the work the first opportunity to accept any suitable work that becomes available, provided, of course, that the worker has the necessary skills and knowledge and is medically able to do the work. You also need to consider whether or not they would pose a safety risk to either themselves or to other workers. And then as the worker's condition improves, the employer is required to offer work more compatible with the worker's abilities. So this means the employer must offer work within the organization as it becomes available. The worker has the right to priority placement in any work which the employer fills or intends to fill once they receive notice that the worker is able to return to work. So if we look at policy 523, which I kind of moved around just so that it fit better with the discussion today, policy 523 addresses the circumstance with any employer who terminates the reemployed injured worker's employment within 6 months of their return to work. So if you terminate the worker within 6 months of the worker coming back, then the employer is presumed to have breached the reemployment obligation. And workers' comp will require the employer to demonstrate that the termination was for reasons unrelated to the injury. So they will ask a lot of questions. You will be required to show evidence and data. And then, of course, if the worker supplies information to demonstrate the contrary, then you will be asked for more information. So you will have to demonstrate if you terminated a worker, why you terminated them. Otherwise, they will determine that you haven't fulfilled your obligation. And of course, with that will be penalties. Policy 526 explains, I apologize, I updated this slide, but it's not reflected here. Policy 526 explains that the employer shall accommodate the work or workplace to facilitate a worker's return to work, providing the worker is capable of performing the essential duties of the pre-injury employment or suitable employment. If the employer claims that the accommodation will cause undue hardship, the onus is on the employer to show adequate evidence of how it will be detrimental or how it will be a hardship on productivity or the operation or on even profitability of the business. If workers' comp agrees that it will cause hardship, then they may provide assistance to help the employer overcome that hardship, or they may choose to help the worker directly. And let me tell you, this is a difficult thing to prove. So once you start going down that route that you have claimed undue hardship, it's a pretty challenging process to be involved with. They will require a lot of evidence in order for you to prove that. And we've actually seen it increasing right across the country with the various workers' comp boards. They seem to have really increased the bar on what evidence you provide to demonstrate undue hardship. So policy 531 discusses some rationale regarding the employer not fulfilling the reemployment obligation. The employer may claim failure to reemploy the worker was due to, could be reasons beyond their control, the employer, unforeseen circumstances, and they may also determine whether or not they agree with that. So policy 532 discusses the topic of collective agreements. It states that where the terms of a collective agreement conflict with the reemployment provisions, whichever provides the worker better reemployment opportunities will prevail, with the exception, of course, of seniority provisions. So established hiring practices in workers' trade or occupation is addressed in 533, where it states that in the opinion of workers' comp, an established hiring and or placement practice in the workers' trade or occupation is reasonable and provides the worker with similar or improved reemployment opportunities, then the reemployment provision won't apply. And just to touch on, Section 71 of the Labor Standards Code is also addressed in Policy 534, advising that where an employer can only meet a reemployment obligation by violating Section 71 of the Labor Code rights of another employee, that employer is excused from its Workers' Compensation Act reemployment duties to the extent necessary to avoid conflict with the Labor Standards Code. So Section 71 of the Labor Standards Code provides a subject to certain exemptions. An employer can only dismiss an employee with 10 years of service if there's just cause. So that just serves to address that. Policy 541 addresses failing to meet the order to reemploy. When workers' comp determines that an employer failed to meet the reemployment obligations, workers' comp will issue a specific and written order to the employer, directing them to reemploy the worker. And failure to do that will immediately have a levy of $2,000 for the first offense. And then there's penalties, of course, for subsequent offenses. In addition to that, Policy 542 outlines the specific penalties in accordance with Section 9 of the Act for a breach of a reemployment obligation. So it's not just the initial penalty, there are other hefty fines for employers that fail to fulfill their obligations. This could include the worker's salary, it could include the cost to retrain the worker, and various other penalties. So it can be quite hefty penalties for failure to reemploy the worker. So these policies are meant to support injured workers throughout their return to work efforts and promote early and safe return to work as being the best option, clinically and vocationally therapeutic. Recognize that return to work minimizes injured workers' wage loss. Of course, if you have an employee back on return to work, then it's important for you to pay them for the time they're at work. Promoting cooperation and active participation of all parties involved in the injured workers' return to work. So there's a role for all stakeholders to play. Injured workers must actively participate in all return to work activities and must be communicated that there are consequences for not participating. So if a worker has functional abilities and you do provide an offer of work that's in accordance with their functional abilities, then they have an obligation to accept that. And it should be communicated to them from the Workers' Compensation Commission that failure to participate could have a consequence for their benefits. It's important to have structure plans. Structure plans help injured workers restore their function, enabling return to work. Injured workers returning to productive work is promoted within the workers' compensation policies. And just keep in mind, from a human rights perspective, this is also the law. So it's not just the workers' compensation legislation that provides the foundation under which employers need to have an obligation to reemploy. It's also in the human rights legislation. So we do typically see sometimes human rights legislation creeping in when employers are not accommodating workers. So I'm going to go into a little bit more specifically now, some of the stakeholder responsibilities. I think it's valuable, as an employer for you to understand what the obligations are, but it's not just important for you to understand what you have to do. It's also important for you to understand what the other stakeholders have to do so that, you can hold people to a level of accountability, having an understanding that we all play a role in the value of return to work. So first, let's look at the employees. So employees, obviously, they need to notify their employer immediately of if they are injured. And in the case of workers' compensation, it states also that they're supposed to notify their employer if they have a close call from, where they could have been injured so that hazards can be fixed. They need to provide workers' comp with complete and accurate and timely information. They also have an obligation to maintain contact with their employer. And this is really important because the onus is not just on the employer to maintain communication with their employee. It's also on the employee to maintain communication with the employer. So there's often cases where we as disability managers for our clients, have to ask workers' compensation to address that barrier because we're trying to reach out to the worker and the worker is failing to have communication with us. So you just need to keep in mind that yes, you as an employer have an obligation, but the employee also has an obligation to maintain communication. The employee also must take all reasonable steps to reduce or eliminate any permanent impairment. So or loss of earnings resulting from an injury. So they need to take all reasonable steps, meaning they need to make sure that they attend their appointments or any recommendations that have been made. Then there's an onus on them to participate and to be actively involved in anything that can eliminate any permanent impairment or loss of earnings. They must participate in any medical aid or healthcare treatment to promote their recovery. So they must attend appointments. So if you become aware that they have not attended appointments or they're missing appointments, then it's important for you to bring that to the attention of workers' compensation, as it's their role to remove those barriers and to remind workers that there could be consequences for failure to participate in their medical aid or any type of healthcare treatment. Employees also need to notify workers' comp immediately if there's any change that could affect their claim, including if they're able to return to work, then they have an obligation to advise WCB of that. They also must undergo a healthcare assessment or a medical examination if requested by the employer, by workers' comp, or by the appeals tribunal. So they would have to participate. They had to actively participate and cooperate in a return to work program. So if you as an employer have offered a return to work program and it's been agreed that it's an appropriate and suitable program, then they have an obligation to participate in that program. And finally, they have to adhere to all of the workers' compensation policies and the Workers' Compensation Act. So now let's move to the employer or employer representative obligations. So the employer is responsible to provide immediate and appropriate transportation for any injured worker in order for them to obtain health care at the time of the injury. So when the injury happened, it's the employer's responsibility to transport the worker to appropriate health care. The employer must notify workers' comp of an injury that requires medical attention and provide information as requested within 5 days of becoming aware of the injury. Injury reports can be filed through My Account. Also notify workers' comp as soon as possible if you are contesting a claim. So as you know, that can be noted on the injury report that you're contesting a claim. And while the presentation today is not about adjudication or contesting a claim, I just want to mention that, as an employer, when you complete that form, failure to say you're going to contest it and then, provide evidence later can result in some problems. So it's important that if you do have objections to the claim, that you state that on the employer injury report and then forward them to workers' compensation. As you know, for soft tissue claim, you can send the worker to the tiered services provider for an assessment. And this can be really helpful to determine if the worker can return to work or if the worker is going to need more treatment. The provider is required to complete a physical abilities report, and that information can be really important because obviously it contains their functional abilities. This will allow you to understand then what's safe for the worker to do and help you identify whether they can return to their pre-injury position, whether they can perform the essential duties of their pre-injury position, or whether you need to now offer suitable work. So that report can be pretty critical. You have an obligation to maintain contact with your injured employee. And from a DMC perspective, for our clients, we usually like to maintain weekly communication with workers who are off on workers' compensation. As an employer, you also need to hold workers' comp accountable for their role in the process. And this is something that we take very seriously at DMC. Workers' comp is spending, your money, which is charged back to you on your assessments, to manage cases. So, you need to hold them accountable, ask lots of questions, and most importantly, be engaged. The system is designed to be self-reliant, so you need to be engaged in the system. You play a very important role, so it's important to ask lots of questions. You also, in accordance with the policies and legislation, which I just discussed, you must offer meaningful work that's safe and suitable if a worker is not able to return to their pre-injury work. So, keep the lines of communication open, not just with your employee, but with all the stakeholders. And it's important not to just communicate, but to collaborate and to try to find solutions and find ways to mitigate barriers. And of course, when a worker is back in your employ participating in early and safe return to work, it's important to pay the worker for the time that they work. So now workers' comp. So workers' comp too has specific responsibilities. So obviously they have to adhere to the Act and the WCB policies. They have to objectively and fairly weigh evidence and make claim decisions in a timely manner. They are also responsible for administering healthcare and the earnings replacement benefits. So in administering the healthcare, that means referring the workers for their, any diagnostic testing or any specialist appointments, and making sure that they attend those appointments. Also assisting in the development and management of return to work plans. So they are also supposed to help with that. Coordinate and monitor the success of healthcare and any rehab processes that were recommended to determine whether or not they should be continued or whether or not a worker should be referred for something else. They also have a responsibility to communicate and collaborate with all the parties involved in the return to work planning process. And also managing worker and employer expectations. So, putting plans in place and setting worker expectations so that workers understand, what the healing time might be for this type of injury and those kinds of things. So managing expectations is a really important role of WCB. But of course, as an employer, I would argue your role as it relates to WCB is asking questions and being engaged in the process. Which we do for our clients. Healthcare providers. So this could be family doctors, occupational therapists, physios, could be chiropractors. So their role is to provide services to injured workers, to assist with their recovery and help them, return to work, to safe work in a timely manner. Also, identifying issues and barriers influencing return to work, and they also have an obligation to make recommendations to address or help mitigate any of those barriers that are identified. They also play a role in managing workers' expectations, especially from a recovery perspective, and communicating and collaborating with all parties in the return to work process. And if you are in a unionized setting, then the union also plays a role. Now, in most cases, when in a unionized setting, we leave it to the worker if they want to have their union representative involved. And of course, if they do, we certainly don't have any problem with that. But the union is also not supposed to put up barriers with regards to helping to bring a worker back to work. So seeking their cooperation can be really valuable. And sometimes it's good to do this upfront so that the process is laid out and workers understand that. But, we always encourage workers, if they feel more comfortable having a union representative present, then, we encourage them to do that. It's perfectly fine. So now we're going to just look a little bit deeper into some of the barriers that might be presented. So for workers, so if you think of this from a worker perspective, some of the barriers that workers have are, just interacting with workers' comp, just knowing what questions to ask and understanding the system, because in most cases, it's a totally foreign process to them. There's also financial strain for workers because they're receiving less pay. There could be an impact on their family relationships now that they're not working or now that they're home. They could be feeling pressure to return to work, and they may not feel like they can, but there could be a lot of pressure. A lot of workers also feel that there's a stigma of being an injured worker, so that can be very challenging. There could be health issues other than those identified. There could be underlying health conditions, and there could also be a fear of re-injury. So these are some common challenges that workers face when they're going through this process. And for employers could have an absence of modified duties, or they may claim that they have an absence of modified duties. I know from our perspective, we have lots of companies who tell us that, especially in the early days of when we work with them, that they, that they don't have much to offer in modified duties, but we always manage to find lots of modified duties within our clients' workplaces. There could also be employers who are seasonal, and that definitely poses a challenge, because when the season shuts down, then obviously it's difficult from an accommodation perspective to be able to have workers at work, and that can present quite a challenge. There could be time lags for treatment and diagnosis, so wait lists. So you're waiting for the worker to have to seek treatment, or you're waiting for them to have some kind of diagnostic test. And that may be a challenge with being able to safely accommodate. There could be relationship issues between the manager and the supervisor and the employee, so there could be some challenges in that regard. The worker's physician may not be educated and fully understand return to work. We also find it very common where the physician may not be educated in this particular workplace. So, it's just the worker that explains the work, and sometimes that's not always an accurate depiction of what an employer may be able to offer. So sometimes the employers feel like they're pitted against the family physician, in that the family physician is saying that, the worker needs to remain off work because they don't fully understand what's going on in the workplace. Sometimes there's a breakdown in communication where the employer has lost contact with the employee, or there just hasn't been good communication maintained, and then it's harder to get that back on track once there's been a breakdown in communication. And sometimes for employers, they don't have good functional information. It's not clear, or it's ambiguous, or they're not really sure what it means. And then that can pose a problem for a company trying to identify what work would be safe or what work might be meaningful that they have to offer. So in order to mitigate some of these barriers, there needs to be communication. And that's why you need to maintain communication, because once something happens, or, once one of these barriers are presented, if there hasn't been good communication, then it's much tougher during during some kind of an issue to get that communication back on track. So, I would recommend that, you really work hard at maintaining the communication obviously right now is a bit more of a challenging time because of the pandemic, but, encouraging workers to bring in their medical notes and, just finding ways to maintain that connection to the workplace. Because once that connection is broken, then it's much more challenging to get it back on track. Return to work planning in advance. So, have identified some modified duties ahead of time. You might want to have a functional abilities form that the worker takes to the doctor or the physiotherapist. Communicate with healthcare providers. You have a right to functional information, so not diagnostic information, but communicating and sending information. If you're concerned that a particular physician doesn't understand your workplace, then you should find a way to communicate with them so that you can create better understanding. Just having company awareness within your workplace that you do offer return to work, and just stating what the process is going to be up front. People manage better when they know what the expectations are. So if you're a company that is going to accommodate workers and has safe options for workers, then it's important to have company awareness around that. And also when a worker is coming back to work, so there is awareness around that. And of course, understanding your roles, which we just talked about with regards to the stakeholder, but also within your own workplace. You may want to have roles assigned to people who understand that a worker's coming back and helping to identify what modified work are. And also understanding what your role is in the entire process. And as an employer, as I stated before, that the system is designed to be self-reliant. So it's designed for you to be able to manage this yourself. I know from DMC's perspective, we prefer to manage in a self-reliant process, and then we involve whichever workers' compensation we're working in across the country. We would involve them if a barrier is presented, to help mitigate that barrier. So implementing return to work. So don't wait until there's an injury to think about return to work opportunities. It's better to do this in advance. So, prepare for worst case scenarios so that, you have a process and a plan in place, and you're not kind of scrambling when something happens. So, plan ahead. The chances are, that you'll have a positive impact, and the likelihood of achieving return to work are better when the earlier it's done in the process. So, don't wait till you have cases to manage. Try to do it beforehand. Have processes in place. And as we stated earlier, when I showed you, and it's the reason actually I wanted to show you the duration early in the presentation, because the odds are increasingly against the employer the longer the situation is left unmanaged. There's all kinds of things that enter into cases once it's left unmanaged. And it's much harder to get things back on track. So having a return to work program in place can drastically reduce the odds by setting the expectation in advance. These expectations will help reduce any stress and anxiety for the injured worker of what the process is going to look like. And it will also create a workplace culture supportive of return to work. So assess your workplace and your positions, break down your tasks. Look at the different physical requirements that are required for the tasks. What's the lifting? How much walking is there? How much standing is there? How much sitting is there? Is there an opportunity to sit and stand? So, because what you're trying to do is think ahead of the different physical requirements, so that when you get that functional information back from the healthcare provider, then you've already thought through what some options might be. So think about what tasks in a worker's job could be modified. It's always better to keep a worker as closely as possible attached to their position. You also need to think about what are the skills of your employees. So what skills do they have? Do they have other skills that, that would make it more flexible for you to be able to move them around elsewhere? Or are their skills pretty defined? If that's the case, then you need to look within that specific area. What are things that need to be done? Is this an opportunity for you to have this worker have some training that you've been looking forward to doing? Or, are there other things that need to be done? Do you have needs in other parts of your business where you might be able to provide some meaningful opportunities to workers? Think about what opportunities you might have that are sedentary, so that a worker will be required to mostly sit. Are there opportunities where there's no lifting and no bending? Because those are common restrictions. Using one arm is also a common restriction if a worker has an injury to an arm. There's also, you need to think about, for companies who have workers who have post-traumatic stress as a result of their work, so they might not be able to be at work. So what kind of opportunities could you have where a worker could provide some meaningful work from home? So you might want to compile a list of these kinds of things. And these are just some examples. Obviously, you can dig much deeper depending on the individual merits of your type of work. So when you know the physical restrictions of the worker, then I would suggest using a hierarchy of return to work. So this is something we are very much like to do at DMC. So having an appropriate return to work is critical to the effective management of the claim and, of course, the costs. And as I stated before, many companies in the early days of working with us, will say, oh, we don't have a lot of opportunities to accommodate workers while they're recovering. And, there might be some minimal exceptions, but we've always been able to find safe return to work options for our clients' workers. Sometimes the options we come up with are quite creative, and evidence shows that keeping the worker connected will significantly reduce the duration. So if you look at the hierarchy of return to work, you should always be looking to get to priority 1. So if you had to start, for example, at priority 5, which is an ease back, a gradual return to work, then you should always be looking to try to get to priority 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1. So, you only move away from their work if you have no other choice when you're trying to accommodate the worker. But if you can keep the worker somehow connected either to their work, to that department, to the employees that work there, then it's much more valuable, and you'll find that the return to work process will go much faster. So in implementing the return to work, maintain contact with your worker as determine essential duties, which can be included in the hierarchy. Use functional abilities information, review options, talk to the employee. Communication is key. And it's always good to put your offer of work in writing. Communicate regularly with workers' comp, especially if any barriers come up. Communicate with the employee. You need to make sure the plan is progressive. I can't tell you how many times we've gone to work with companies where a worker is in modified work and they've been there for months and months. So you need to have the plan be progressive. So evaluate it often. And as I talked about in the hierarchy, you should always be looking to move the worker closer to their pre-injury position. It's good to set expectations. You can always adjust the expectations, but being able to say that this plan is a 3-week plan or a 4-week plan, it's good to set expectations and goals. You can always adjust it. So how does this look in real life? These are just some examples that, I don't need to go into them in great detail, but I just wanted to give you some idea. In a kitchen, it might be preparing food in a seated position. You might be taking phone orders. In the auto industry, it might be doing safety checks or oil changes. In nursing home and hospitals, it could be providing companionship, light personal care duties, calling family members, helping with feeding, or partnering up with another worker in the trucking. It could be driving with help. It could be doing short local runs. In a warehouse, it could be helping with inventory. In retail, it could be greeting customers, answering the phone, disinfecting surfaces from a janitorial perspective. And of course, now in the time with the pandemic, in the time of COVID, disinfecting surfaces is certainly a position that we've seen a lot of employees avail of. In plants and factories, it could be workstations that only require supervision of belts, actioning buttons. In construction, it could be audit checks, doing some installations of doorknobs, for example. It could be painting, taping, and all of these industries now, we could also use sanitizing. So it could be an opportunity to catch up on training. There could be some administrative duties in an office setting if it's available, or also available to work from home. And there could be help with supervising duties. So you need to ask yourself, if I could have an extra employee for a few weeks, what would I have them do? So DMC has a wealth of experience, with seasonal companies. We do a lot of work in the ambulance industry where we've had to be extremely creative in helping workers find modified work. And we also have a network of companies where sometimes we're able to have workers work with other companies to do their modified work. So the system is designed to be self-reliant, as I stated before. There's no cookie cutter model for return to work, but there are fundamentals. So, as the employer, you play a major role in the success of return to work. Don't wait for workers' comp to initiate. You should be out ahead. Workers' comp can help you remove barriers. And of course, remember confidentiality. I actually, for this presentation, doesn't have my contact information, but any questions? And also maybe Jill, if you could put in the chat our contact information in case anybody has specific questions that they don't want to ask in a group setting, I can certainly make myself available to help or to answer any questions that you might have. So it's just dallas@dmconsulting.ca. So I'm now ready to take some questions. I'll stop the share stop. You're way ahead of me, Cindy. Thank you for that. So yeah, so let's go ahead with any questions that anybody might have.
Okay, thanks so much, Dallas. That was a very
Can't hear you,
informative.
Cindy.
Oh, let me
There you
see.
go. Okay, good.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yes, thank you very much. That was a very, very informative presentation, and I'm sure very applicable to many, many employers. So I do have a few questions here. I'll just jump right in. What is typically the biggest challenge for employers when creating return to work plans?
Usually the biggest challenge is functional information. Having appropriate functional information that allows an employer to determine what's safe for them to do. So I would encourage you, if you find yourself in a situation where you don't have current functional information, of course, reach out to your case manager, or you can send the worker to a healthcare provider to obtain that functional information for yourself.
Okay, yeah. And what is usually the thing that employers get wrong for return to work planning, or not even get wrong, but have, get wrong was actually written in the question. So we'll stick with that.
There's so many.
Okay.
Which is why we have a business. I think there's oh my goodness. I mean, where to start? I think a lot of companies think they don't have work to offer. So I think that in itself can be a barrier. I think that there's a fear in asking for information, and they think they're not allowed to have information. There's also, I think, a misconception from employers' perspective that workers' comp is going to do it. And they will when they get around to it. But, the system is designed for you to be engaged and involved. And, for our clients, we don't wait for workers' comp to do it. We're way out there in front. And I think you can see from the duration in Nova Scotia, with the duration being so high, clearly there's a lot of room for improvement for employers to be much more engaged and taking ownership of the return to work process. So there's a lot of areas for improvement. I think we could do a workshop just on that, actually.
Okay. We'll have to look at that next month. Okay, when it comes to duty to accommodate, what are the boundaries employers need to be aware of?
Well, they need to accommodate to the point that it'll cause undue hardship. So you would have to demonstrate undue hardship. Now, there's specific parameters around the number of employees you have to have. So you can find those specific parameters, whether how long a worker was working with you. So if a worker was with you 12 consecutive months, if you have 20 employees, if a worker is seasonal and they've demonstrated the pattern, then you fall under obligation to reemploy, unless you're construction. And then there's a different set of rules. So I would encourage companies to look up those parameters specifically. I mean, I touched on them. We'd need to spend really a couple of days going through every single piece of that. So I don't want to contend that I have given them all to you. I would encourage you to look them up, but you do have to accommodate to the point that it will cause undue hardship. And then if you claim undue hardship, you have to prove that. And there's been some recent case law around undue hardship. And it seems now that the workers' compensation boards all across the country are really pushing employers to demonstrate where they're claiming undue hardship, to provide a lot more evidence of that. So I would encourage you to be careful about claiming undue hardship because you may find yourself, in quite a situation and in having to demonstrate that that is indeed true. And the bar is pretty high to demonstrate undue hardship.
Okay. Okay, and what are the responsibilities for the employee to disclose?
I don't know what you mean to disclose, at what point.
Say this was a pre-prepared question. Employee maybe to share. What are the responsibilities for the employee to share?
Well, I mean, the employee has a responsibility to participate in the process. If functional information demonstrates that the work is safe and meaningful, then they have an obligation to participate, and workers' comp would have to remind them. But I think in the presentation, I did touch on some of the responsibilities of the employee with regards to, they have to participate in appointments. They have to, participate in work if it's offered and it's safe. And then as the employer, you need to be proactive in managing that. If you offer a worker early and safe return to work and they don't show up, or they show up and they leave halfway through, or it's not consistent, or they're not doing the work that was set out, then you have an obligation to be part of that and to to provide that information to workers' comp, that the worker, they play a role. They have a process that they need to participate, and it's important for the employer, to be engaged and managing that. And also, as I stated earlier, making sure that the plan is progressive and that the worker just doesn't stay at a stage where, from a modified work perspective.
Okay, looks like I have two more here. This is a good one. In your experience dealing with employers, what's the biggest lesson you've learned that you can pass on to all attendees?
Oh my God, there's so many. The biggest lesson I've learned, I think the biggest lesson I've learned is that there's always ways to accommodate the worker. I mean, when you think of the ambulance industry, I mean, if a worker has a physical limitation, it's tough to put someone in an ambulance on modified duty if you show up at an accident and they can't get at the ambulance. I mean, that's not going to work well. And also from a PTSD perspective, and a worker not being able to go to work because, they're suffering from PTSD, and the mere sight of work could be a trigger for them. So if we've been able to find a way for early and safe return to work for those employees, then I think that that it's always possible to be able to find modified, meaningful work for a company. So I think the biggest lesson is there's always a way around it.
Excellent. Okay, and our final question, you may have covered this, does the role of return to work typically fall under HR?
That's a tough question because some companies don't have HR departments. So, so yes, I mean, I guess from our perspective, when we work with our clients, sometimes we're working with HR, sometimes we're working with safety departments, sometimes we're working with the CEO or finance. So I think it really depends. I mean, typically, yes, I do see often that HR would play a role, but often it's a tough role for HR too, because they play the role as well as maintaining good relationships with employees. So I guess being a third party, we can sometimes ask the questions that might be challenging for people in HR to find, that they might find themselves in pretty sticky situations. So, I obviously, I guess that's why a lot of companies like having a third party do these things, because it can get a little complicated, but also it can have an impact on employer-employee relations. So yes and no. I've seen it, and I've, it really depends on the structure of that particular company as to who
Right.
it falls to.
Yeah, I think it, again, goes to show why it's so valuable to have a third party help with this return to work, for sure. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what we have seen with our clients and the success. And I mean, most of our clients, after working with us for, a year or so, they're paying below the base rate, because, we know the tips and tricks and understanding how companies can, and we also work with so many companies that all of our clients get to benefit from that, shared practices or best practices that we're using in one company, and we can put them in another company. It's also really important not to underestimate the value of industries working together. And we've certainly had a lot of experience with industries working together and being able to share best practices among an industry, even though they're competitors, because then their base rate can go down. And when you lower the base rate, then if you do find yourself in a situation where you have claims, the percentage of the surcharge is not as great because the base rate is lower. So, working as an industry and sharing best practices has proven very effective. And we work with a lot of industries, and I think, I take a lot of satisfaction from seeing industry base rates drop.
Excellent. And just to reiterate, you work with all industries, right?
We do, yeah. We work with all industries, from factory freezer trawlers, oil and gas, to hospitals, to forestry, to sawmills, to auto dealerships, to restaurants. I mean, wow. Everybody where you can get hurt, and even call centers. I mean, we're there's a lot of industries where they're sick, and our processes, while we're talking today about workers' compensation, there's also a lot of organizations that have sick leave issues. So, we're in universities because we see a lot of sick leave issues in universities. So those are areas where we also spend a lot of time and have had great success for our clients. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I hope today that people gain something valuable that they can take away from this, a few tips and tricks to help them in this process. I mean, as Atlantic Canadians, we'd like Atlantic Canada to be prosperous, and we'd like for companies to want to come to Atlantic Canada to do business. So we need to keep our workers' compensation rates low in order for that to happen.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, on that note, I think that we'll end there, because that was the perfect closing remarks for you, Dallas. So thank you again.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar. So join us next week for a webinar with the Canada Deposit Insurance Company on how they're building resilience and confidence in Canada's financial system. And on March 25th, we're hosting the virtual 2021 Halifax Business Awards. We've partnered with Scamway and Liquid Assets to bring you an at-home food and beverage experience while you cheer on our finalists. This webinar was recorded and will be available to all attendees shortly on YouTube. So thanks everyone, and have a great day.